Hello peoples of the internet, I'm Mo and I am here today with my promised video on pre-Tolkien fantasy recommendations. So I'm actually going to be doing this a little bit as a hybrid between a historical overview of kind of what was going on in fantasy and the development of fantasy during this time, and partially as recommending some books to you that I have enjoyed. So I'm going to talk about 3 different authors who were writing fantasy before Tolkien and share a few of each of their books with you guys and talk maybe a little bit about how they influenced the genre. So yeah, I'm just gonna get right into them. So fantasy as a genre really began during the Victorian period. Up until that time you had a lot of the fantastic involved in storytelling. There was a large history of fairy tales, and at the time there was a prominent use of ghost stories, and that was very popular as you read in Charles Dickens and some of the other Victorian writers. But up until that time there hadn't really been a book that would be what we would consider a fantasy novel. And that changed with George Macdonald. He is considered by some to be essentially the father of fantasy, and he published what is often considered to be the first actual fantasy novel back in 1858. And that was entitled Fantasies. And this is one of the 2 adult fantasy novels that he wrote. It's about a man who goes into fairyland and his adventures that he has there. So it's not a really strong plot structured novel. It's more like a series of adventures. Kind of think like Alice in Wonderland for adults. And although I'm not sure about this, I think that this book may have been an influence on Lewis Carroll in writing Alice in Wonderland. George MacDonald and Lewis Carroll were personal friends, and it was George MacDonald who convinced Lewis Carroll to publish Alice, which I think happened about 10 years after the publication of his novel Fantasies. So overall, if you're looking at George MacDonald's novels, there are some common threads. All of them do tend to be rather philosophical, and they do have a slower pace generally. His adult novels at least have a slower pace. His children's novels are much quicker reads. But this, primarily because it doesn't have a lot of characters, you're following one man as he wanders through fairyland. So it is slow-paced, and it is very philosophic, but it's also very interesting in what it is. The thing that I think George MacDonald was really the best at was theme, and in almost, I think, every novel of his that I've read, I can pick out a 1 or a few word theme that really just sums up the entire thing and what it's about. And so in fantasies, the major theme is love. And this is not necessarily love in a romantic sense, although that is touched on, but it's really the sort of love that you might feel for a family or for friends or for mankind in general. And that is really looked into and looked at from many different angles. Another thing that you get in some of MacDonald's novels is appearances from characters out of myth or folklore. So in fantasies, we have appearances from Percival, the Red Knight, and also from the statue from, what is that myth called? Pygmalion. Sorry, I had a bit of a mind blank there. So yeah, I really enjoy this novel. It's not one that I've reread as often as some of his other work, but it's definitely very interesting to look at, especially considering that it is often considered to be the first fantasy novel that was ever written. A little bit later on in MacDonald's career, he published what are some of his better remembered works, one of which is The Princess and the Goblin. And this is a children's fantasy novel, and it follows 2 main characters, one of whom is the titular princess, and the other is a little boy who works in the mines. And so the princess lives in this manor house up on this mountain where she's being cared for by her nurse and some servants while her father is off doing other things throughout the country. And in these mountains, down deep in the caves, is where the goblins live. And so the princess and the little miner boy, Curdy, discover some schemes that the goblins are planning, having to do with the humans and some political things going on, and they have to sort of save each other and save the kingdom in thwarting those schemes. And this is a really fun, fast-paced read, and it's just overall a really sweet children's story. The main theme in this one is really trust and how and why we trust people. And there are all these things that go wrong in the story when certain characters do not trust other characters, either because of their age or because of their station, rather than having a good reason to not believe them. And so that's the major theme of this one. There is also a sequel to this, The Princess and Curdie, which I also enjoy, but I'm not really going to go into in this video. The last one of Macdonald's books that I want to talk about is, I don't remember if it's his last published work or just his last fantasy work, and that is Lilith. This is the second of his adult novels, and it was published towards the end of his career in 1895. So coming up on the turn of the century. And this one, like fantasies, is also a portal fantasy. So it's about a man who finds his way into a different dimension. And in this dimension, the things which are in our world either invisible or intangible, like dreams and fears and songs and prayers and these types of things, have a physical form. And so if you're in this world, things like fears and nightmares would appear as monsters, and things like songs might appear as birds or this type of thing. So it does have a little bit of an allegorical element to it, but not the sort of in-your-face allegory like some of them are. This one also does include appearances from characters that have appeared in other myths, and these come out of Jewish folklore. So the main, or not the main character, but the titular character of Lilith is a character out of Jewish folklore, by which I do not mean the Bible necessarily, although there are some characters in here which are also mentioned in the Bible but are also part of Jewish folklore, but those are two separate things. So this story is a lot darker than fantasies, and the main theme is really about death and sort of life and death and the way that we perceive and act towards those things. And I think this is probably my favorite of Macdonald's works. I have reread this one. I will warn you that it is not a fast read. It's, especially right in the first 2 chapters, very dense. And he uses a lot of big words and talks about metaphysical things. Once you get through the first couple of chapters, there's a lot more plot. But I know some people sort of pick up this book to start it and then are put off right away. So if you're looking into reading it, I would forewarn you about that. But these works by Macdonald are things that had a large influence on fantasy as a genre. They were influential both to Lewis and to Tolkien, who obviously are very big names in the history of fantasy. Like I said, he did write in more of an older style, so if you like works that are coming out of the Victorian period and you're fine with the sort of pacing and the style that they are written in, and you also like fantasy, I would definitely recommend that you check out something by George Macdonald. I think he's just wonderful. The next of the authors that I'm going to be talking about in this video is Edith Nesbit. Nesbit was a contemporary of Macdonald, but the beginning of her career lined up with the second half of his, so she was writing a little bit later than he was, and she was more of a 20th century author than a 19th century author, and she wrote primarily for children, and so you get a lot of sort of fantasy short stories and fantasy novels that are aimed at children, or maybe what today might be considered middle grade. And they're overall very entertaining, a lot of fun. They are not that heavy sort of philosophical thing that Macdonald was writing, but essentially, in my mind, they are just pure entertainment, and I really love them. So Nesbit wrote a lot of books, and I don't have time to talk about all of them here, so I'm just going to pick a few to talk about. The first is a trilogy, which is often referred to as the Five Children trilogy. The first book, which I think is one of her more famous, is Five Children and It, which is about this family of kids who goes out to stay in the country for the summer, and they find this fairy who can give them a wish every day, and so they spend the summer making wishes and discovering that you need to be careful when you make wishes because they get into all sorts of trouble and are essentially learning lessons along the way. Each book in this trilogy is really its own story, so I originally actually read this trilogy out of order because I was unaware that the book I was reading was number 3, and that book is The Amulet, and I think it is my favorite of the books in this trilogy. The Amulet follows 4 of the 5 children from the first book as they are sort of on a quest to find the other half of this amulet. So they have one half of a magical amulet and the other half is somewhere and they need to get to it so that they can accomplish their goal. And the half of the amulet that they have allows them to essentially travel through time and space. And so in this case, it's space as in different places on Earth. They don't actually go into outer space, which would have been cool, but they end up going to places like ancient Babylon and Atlantis and having all these different adventures. And the Samiad, which is the fairy from the original book, is also with them on these adventures. And I love the character of the Samiad. He's just like really sort of like grouchy and sarcastic, and I just think he's a lot of fun. And this is a book that I actually read because I heard it quoted as being one of the main sort of inspirations for the Chronicles of Narnia, and you do have a lot of similar things going on. You have the 4 siblings, 2 sisters, 2 brothers off on this adventure, and there are other things that are reminiscent of me. There's this section with the Queen of Babylon that really reminds me a lot of The Magician's Nephew when like they bring the queen from Charn into London. So yeah, if you're really a fan of the Chronicles of Narnia, I would definitely recommend picking up at least the 3rd book in this series. I don't think you need to read them in order. They're a series in that they follow all the same characters, but each book is really a story in itself. I also want to talk a little bit about Nesbit's short fiction because I really enjoy her short stories. In particular, there's one called Melisandre, which really is making fun of a lot of fairy tale tropes, and so it is about a princess who is cursed at her christening to be bald. And it is about what happens when she tries to get her hair back and all of the trouble that occurs and how she is eventually saved from this curse and all of these things that have happened to her. It's really funny. I definitely recommend it, and it's short, so you can go look it up. Otherwise, I would like to recommend a collection of her short fiction, and that is the Book of Dragons. And so these are all short stories that in some way or other have a dragon in them. So in some of them, it's someone's trying to rescue someone from a dragon. In some of them, it's an island that's being terrorized by a dragon, and they have giant mice and tiny little elephants. And one of them has a frozen dragon that's made out of ice. One of them has a character who opens up a book and all of the pictures on the inside come out and come to life. And these are just really fun, really whimsical, children's fantastical short stories. I really enjoyed each of them, and if that's the sort of thing that you guys enjoy, I would definitely recommend picking up some Edith Nesbit sometime in the future. And the 3rd author on the list for today, and one that you guys have probably been waiting for to show up, is Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, 18th Baron of Dunsany, or Lord Dunsany for short. So, as some of you who've been following my channel know, I have recently started reading some of Lord Dunsany's works, and I've really been enjoying them. Dunsany worked mostly in short form, and he was writing at the same time as Nesbit, but after George Macdonald. And what he did was different in that he really is all about the sense of wonder. Dunsany really just takes sense of wonder and he distills it down into this little thing, and he puts it on a few pages, and it's beautiful. And I don't know that anyone has ever done this as well as he did, and I'm not the only one who has that opinion. I know lots of authors have mentioned him as having been an influence and just how lovely his writing is. And I was reading about him recently, and I found this wonderful quote from Jo Walton just describing Dunsany's writing that I wanted to share with you guys. And she says, "What he did better than anyone was to take poetic images and airy tissues of imagination and weight them down at the corners with perfect details to craft a net to catch dreams in." And I think that really sums up Dunsany and his styles really very well. Dunsany was really about creating an atmosphere and creating a picture, and his works weren't necessarily plot heavy. Sometimes there's not much of a plot at all, sometimes there's more, but it's really just about the beauty of the image. And so the first of Dunsany's works that was published was The Gods of Pagane, and he actually self-published this book himself because it was so different that none of the publishers would take it because they were afraid that it wouldn't sell. It was later on republished by a publisher, and he never had to self-publish anything again because his works were really very well received at the time, and he is one of the reasons that fantasy was sort of pushed more into the mainstream, and he really started to make it more popular. And so for that reason, was a very big influence on the genre itself, but also on a lot of the authors that came after him within the genre. And so the first book, which I just mentioned, The Gods of Pagane, is a sort of created mythology of this world called Pagana that he wrote. And so it's a series of short stories about these different gods and this world and the people living on the world and the prophets and all of these different things. And it also really delves into human nature and the way that the people are described and the things that they do and the way that they interact with their world and the other characters. And overall, I just think it's beautiful. The writing is particularly gorgeous. And in his next book that he published, Time in the Gods, he continued on telling the stories of that world. I really enjoy and really recommend both of these books. I've actually only read 4 Dunsany books at this time, but I have some more of his that I'm planning on getting to. The other one that I have read by him recently was The Sword of Welleran and Other Stories. This is a collection of short stories that are, unlike the first 2, not connected to each other. Some of which I really, really liked, others of which I wasn't as keen on, but all of them are really beautifully written. So if you like short fiction especially, and you haven't given Dunsany a try, please pick something of his up. And even if you don't, if you really love that sense of wonder that comes in your fantasy or your sci-fi books, he just distills it down to this tiny little bit, and it's like that's all the story is just sense of wonder without anything else. And some people may not like that, but he's been so much of an influence on so many people that I do really think that he holds a very wide appeal, and I wish that he was more widely read today. So those are the 3 authors that I wanted to talk to you guys about in this video. I may in the future be doing more videos about some more historic genre fiction, so if you guys would like to see more of that, let me know. And if you've read any of these books or things that are older, not so well-known fantasy, definitely let me know about those down in the comments as well. I would love to hear from you all, and I will be seeing you guys next time. Happy reading!